Welcome to the Oldie podcast. This is from our literary lunch featuring guest speakers and kindly sponsored by Noble Caledonia, specialists in worldwide small ship cruising. Our lunches are held monthly. Details and how to book can be found in our magazine and on the website www.theoldie.co.uk.
Thank you so much. Jill Johnson, love, A Golden Summer on the Grand Canal.
Good afternoon. Thank you, James and Harry. Can you hear me? For inviting me to the Oldie Literary Lunch. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. 3 years ago, if anyone told me I would be attending the Oldie Literary Lunch as a guest speaker, never mind as a member of the public, I would have thought they were mad. I'd never published a word in my life, nor did I have any ambition to do so. So how did over 90-year-old non-celebrity, first-time author, without a literary agent, get to write a book? Never mind getting it published, never mind finding herself standing, well, actually sitting here before you. What is Love from Venice about? It is a memoir of 1 year, 1957, when I was 25. I had fallen in love with David Ross, an architect from an exotic Russian-Scottish family. When David unexpectedly moved to Paris, I knew I had to act fast if I was to have any hope of catching up with him. So I threw my cards in the air and said goodbye to my job at the National Gallery, where I'd worked for 5 years, and said goodbye to my parents and embarked on an adventure. A few weeks later, by a series of amazing coincidences, all in the best tradition of romantic comedy, I found myself living with a very grand family in Venice, name of Brandolini Dada. The head of the family, Conte Brandolini Dada, had married Cristiana Agnelli, one of Giovanni Agnelli's younger sisters. Unwittingly, I was ensconced in one of the richest families in Europe. My job was to chaperone 2 little boys, not so little, Rui and Leonello, although they already spoke perfect English. For the next 7 months, I wandered through a gold-plated realm and bumped into the luminaries of the day, including Nancy Mitford, with whom I spent 3 weeks chatting on a deck chair on the Lido beach. Viewed from a Venetian palazzo, life seemed almost surreal. 2 charming butlers, Domenico and his sidekick Angelo, waited on me hand and foot, always on the beach. When the count and countess were not there. Oh, it stopped all. When they were on their travels, I was put in charge of the palazzo and its staff of 14. When a heat wave struck Venice, I drove the Count and the children in the family Cadillac up to St. Moritz. Meanwhile, I wrote long letters to David, describing my life, the people I met, and the places I went. I loved every minute of my time, of my time in Venice, and I learned many life lessons. In the end, I left Venice for Paris to marry David, whose entire estate fitted inside one suitcase. Love from Venice captures the character of Venice during the last years of the European Grand Tour, but before the arrival of mass tourism. It evokes the values of my pre-war generation, values of stoicism, authenticity, innocence, imagination, and above all, determination and stamina, qualities that can be an example and inspiration to everyone. The book also represents an extended thank you letter to the Brandolini Dada family, who welcomed me into their lives and gave me an unforgettable year. Not only does Love from Venice offer a unique palazzo angle on Venice, but it also represents a perspective that any present-day au pair would be prevented from describing thanks to non-disclosure agreements. The creation of the book is almost as unlikely as the events it describes. Rummaging through some old family papers in 2015, I came across a plastic file stuffed with handwritten letters. Recognizing the letters were those I had written to David from Venice, he clearly thought they contained something that was valuable. When I showed the letters to my son Rory, sorry, Rory. I beg your pardon. I've lost my place. When I showed the letters to my son Rory, a journalist and writer, he saw the material for a potential book. It took the pandemic for Rory to have the time properly to research all the people whom I described in letters. Like Venice itself, Love from Venice has been curated from a multiplicity of sources and then somehow brought to life by Rory's strange gift for imaginative recreation. It took us more than 3 years to write. When the book came out in January, I felt honoured that Leonello Brandolini Dada came to the launch. It was the first time we had met in 67 years. Among several reviews, the Oldie very kindly gave it the cover and 4 pages of the April edition. Meanwhile, I have been almost overwhelmed by the response from strangers and friends alike who have got in touch to say how much they enjoyed the book's evocation of Venice, its breadth of themes, its portrayal of Nancy Metford and others, and personal recollection of families and family ties, and my personal story of a young woman's determination to take possession of her life. I was thrilled to receive emails from Rui Brandolini, Dada himself, and from the Contessas Cristiana Brandolini and Dada herself, who is still going strong in her 98th year. She said how the book brought back wonderful memories. Writing Love from Venice has been one of the most satisfying things I've done in my life. It has relived wonderful times, and it has brought my family closer together. It has literally given me a new lease of life. David and I married 4 months after the time frame of the book. 3 of our 4 sons are here today. The other one's perfectly well. Sorry, couldn't resist that. Even though David died 15 years ago, sadly, he played an important role in the book. He took the photograph of me that appears on the cover of the book, showing me standing on the balcony of the Palazzo Brandolini, smiling at a letter. I've just got to say it's the most beautiful palace on the Grand Canal. But now I can follow in the literary. Love from Venice is my first book, and most likely my last, but I can now follow in the literary footsteps of my younger brother, Hugh Johnson. The great wine and gardening writer, who is sitting next to me, and to whom I dedicate this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gill, and I can assure you that in your 90s you're an extremely young person at the Oldie to write your first book, so we look forward to plenty more. You may have noticed that we're in the National Liberal Club, home to a party that once dominated government for many years and that was then eclipsed for decades. So we thought it was a good time to get a speaker to talk about the Tory party. Our speaker was due to be Liz Truss, who had to unfortunately pull out because of the election. She was due to talk about how the Tory party can save the Western world. Our next speaker doesn't quite agree with that. He is Geoffrey Wheatcroft, an extremely distinguished journalist who started his journalistic life as literary editor to our sainted former editor, Alexander Chancellor, at The Spectator magazine. And his books include Churchill's Shadow, Le Tour, A History of the Tour de France, and with perfect timing, almost as if he'd just had a word with Rishi Sunak, published just before the election, his new book, Bloody Panico, or Whatever Happened to the Tory Party. Ladies and gentlemen, Geoffrey Wheatcroft.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I seem to be double mic'd. I hope that there isn't an echo. Harry actually concealed from me the fact that Liz Truss was going to be another speaker until quite near the moment, and then of course she is no longer speaking to us today because of other events. And I have to say that I've never felt more gratitude to anyone than I do to Rishi Sunak for calling this election just as my book was published. Although Liz Truss's previously announced presence and then her absence reminded me of what happened 19 years ago when I published a book called The Strange Death of Tory England, to which this book is a kind of afterthought. But the book was shortlisted for the Channel 4 Book Prize. Don't worry, I didn't win. And some bright spark doing publicity, I'm so sorry about thought that it would be amusing to arrange it, I won't say quite like this, but like the Booker Prize dinner. There would be tables and we would have an early dinner. And so I found myself sitting next to the leader of the Conservative Party at that time, Michael Howard, leader of the opposition, who not long before had ejected Ian Duncan Smith. Then we made light, bantering conversation, talking about common acquaintances, and the same bright spark doing publicity had thought it would be clever to film the judges of the prize in their deliberations. Well, Michael Howard was one of the judges. Not only to film it, but to show it on a huge screen. 14 years ago, Ferdinand, Harry's father, and I were judges of the Orwell Prize, along with two others. And thank God our deliberations were not filmed, let alone shown. So, as the evening went on, they showed on this big screen the judges discussing the different books. So I had to listen first of all to the late Sir Gerald Kaufman deriding my book as a piece of absurd nonsense. And then, better still, Michael Howard speaking in most contemptuous tones about the book, whose author he was sitting next to. And there was nothing for it, for a slight pause, and then what I think is called a nervous laugh from Michael, and we went on to talk about other matters. I was teased not only by Michael Howard, but by others for writing a book called The Strange Death of Tory England at that time. But without being too self-congratulatory, I think it might have been not so much mistimed as just a little ahead of its time. Because what is happening in the Conservative Party today, compared with what has happened to it at many previous elections, looks like not merely a severe defeat, but something possibly more terminal. The title of my book, Bloody Panico, is an allusion. About 50 years ago, when there was turmoil among the Tory MPs, as there always has been at one time or another, for some reason or another, they would be called to order by that splendid old salt, Rear Admiral Sir Morgan Giles MP, who would rally his fellow MPs with the words, "Pro bono publico, no bloody panico." Unfortunately, bloody panico has been the prevailing mode in the Conservative Party for some time past, and I don't think they're going to be any less panic-stricken on the 5th of July, the morrow of the general election. The latest poll suggests that they could be facing something like the wipeout the Canadian Tories suffered in 1993 when they were down to 2 seats, although, in fact, the latest polls commissioned by the Daily Mail and GB News, who won't have wanted to hear this, said that they would be reduced to something under 100 MPs. How this happened is a puzzle, which even to me, and I've written the book and I ought to be able to explain it, but I'm not sure I can. This was, after all, it's not just that we have had in this country something called a Tory party for 350 years, even if there isn't much in common between the Church and King Cavaliers of the reign of King Charles II and the rather motley crew of the reign of King Charles III. But there has been some form, tenuous continuity, all the way through. And only now, not only that, I should say, but for 150 years out of the since Disraeli's landslide election in the 1874 general election, the Tories have been in power for almost 100 out of 150 years. And there is absolutely no possible comparison or parallel with this in any other country which has had democratic government or even non-democratic government. And the Tories have had this astonishing gift for reinvention and for remodelling themselves and for taking advantage of changing circumstances. They were the party of Church and King once, they were the party in the early 19th century of the land-owning gentlemen of England, but they managed to find some way of compromising with the new commercial and industrial bourgeoisie, and not only in political but in personal terms. As Karl Marx said, in France, the bourgeois cut off their aristocrats' heads. In England, they married their daughters. And by the end of the century, when Lord Salisbury, a thoroughgoing reactionary, but nevertheless a very clever man, and Queen Victoria's last Prime Minister, accepted what he called villa conservatism, meaning the new suburban middle classes. And, what's more, the Tories prospered after the 1918 Representation of the People Act, that is to say, the measure which gave the vote to all men over 21 and most women. And yet it was widely perceived, hoped or feared, depending on who you were, that this extension of the franchise would mean permanent rule by parties of the left, possibly the Liberals, but who were then in decline, or more likely the New Labour Party. But that didn't happen. And the Tories went on regrouping, reshaping themselves, and holding office again and again. They survived, incidentally, the enfranchisement of women. It is something for Rachel Reeves and Harriet Harman and Polly Toynbee to ponder, that without any question, if women had not been enfranchised, Labour would have done very much better over the last 100 years, electorally speaking. Then, in 2010, they returned to office to come forward to the period after my first book, in coalition and then in government on their own. And then something went wrong. Quite what it is difficult at this rather close juncture to explain. Things fell apart. Obviously, part of it was Brexit, part of it was Boris Johnson. I ought to keep off the subject of him, but I will remind you of two things about Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, who uses the stage name of Boris, rather like Sting or Beyonce. In 2014, Anne Applebaum, who's the American neoconservative journalist who worked for The Spectator 20 years earlier, came to London and had dinner with her old friend and colleague Boris Johnson, who said to her then that no one sane would ever contemplate this country's leaving the European Union. 2 years later, he was advocating just such a withdrawal. But then, as Dominic Lawson, who is a Eurosceptic but an intelligent one, has said, Boris Johnson never believed in Brexit until he realised that it was the only way he could achieve the leadership of the Conservative Party. And it was a sad day, I think, for British politics, when whatever view one took of remain or leave, one of our most consequential decisions for a generation was taken partly through the intervention of an unprincipled opportunist, and it's very difficult to deny that's what he is. Since then, well, look at them. I mean, they have staggered from one disaster to one screw-up. They don't quite know who they are anymore. When Rishi Sunak gave that desperately embarrassing and poignant performance announcing the election outside Downing Street in pouring rain while a prankster was playing "Things Can Only Get Better," I couldn't help thinking that looking back over the last few years, a more apt ditty would have been "Send in the Clowns." The fact is that the Tories are going to lose this election. The only question is just how heavily. I would say at that point that whatever one's view, even whether one is a Tory or not, there has never been a time when a party of decent constitutional conservatism is more needed in this country, and indeed it would be needed in other European countries, where everywhere the radical right is in the ascendant. The one lesson the Tories need to remember from now on is what Michael Oakeshott said, the conservative philosopher. Conservatism is not a doctrine, but a disposition. And English Toryism had many vices, but it had certain virtues. Pragmatism, pessimism, skepticism, and sheer common sense. They are the characteristics which have completely deserted the Tories for some years past, and they will only recover, in my view, when they rediscover those virtues. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. Our last speaker is one of Britain's leading classicists. She's produced an extraordinary amount of books given her young age. Her first book was Catullus' Bread Spread. Then she wrote In the Shadow of Vesuvius. She hit no higher honour than to become the Ladybird book expert on Homer. And her latest book, widely well reviewed, is The Missing Thread, A New History of the Ancient World Through the Women Who Shaped It, by Dr. Daisy Dunn.
Well, thank you. You'll have noticed that I'm not Liz Truss either, for which I am sorry. Or maybe I'm not. I actually met Liz Truss for the first time about sort of 9 months after she left Downing Street, or to put it another way, about 10 months after she arrived at Downing Street. And she was actually very friendly, so I'm sort of sorry not to see her again in some respects, because I actually came in here today thinking of something she once said, and that was that nobody wants to be in a room or their business to be funded because they are a woman. Of all the things that Liz Truss has said, I happen to agree with that one. Something that worried me about writing a new history of the ancient world through women was that people would think I've shoehorned some girls into the grand narrative of ancient history for the sake of equality and then brand me woke. To which I'd probably respond, ladies and gentlemen, I write for The Spectator. The fact of the matter is that the women of the ancient world are often just a lot more interesting than the men. Think of I, Claudius, for example. On the one hand, you have the very sort of doltish, ineloquent Tiberius, who just pines after his ex-wife, Vipsania. And the Roman historians paint quite a similar picture of the man. And they also inform us that one of his favourite foods was cucumber. I think you can tell a lot about a man whose favourite food is cucumber. On the other hand, we have his brilliant mother, Livia, so memorably played by Sian Phillips in the series. And she was accused of bumping off pretty much every possible rival to her son's succession. There's a particularly brilliant Latin source revealing that while Livia tried to sort of live up to the reputation that was expected of her, she'd sort of live this very frugal life, she'd make her husband's clothes like a good old Roman matron. Behind the scenes, she also had the most enormous entourage of slaves and helpers with very precise job titles. So she had not only shoemakers and goldsmiths, but she had a pearl setter, a mirror maker, something called in Latin a colorator, which meant it was someone who basically re-dyed your clothes whenever they started to fade through sort of overwashing or exposure to sunlight. She had a couple of male perfumiers, so I think you can definitely tell who was in charge. In Greece as well, the women were often a lot more surprising than the men. Pericles enjoyed all the accolades, of course he did, and many of those were well-deserved, but not all of them were. He once came strolling back into Athens after leading this victory over the Greek island of Samos in a civil war. And he expected everyone to come and give him a big pat on the back and celebrate his victory. And lots of people did that. But there was one woman who stepped forward with a very different opinion, and her name was Panico. And she was a daughter of Miltiades. It was a well-known military figure. And she reminded him that he'd just lost Athens, many of its best young men, in a war against a fellow Greek city, not a foreign enemy. And she was about 50 years old. She was really sort of an oldie for that time. And Pericles took one look at her, and he smiled, and he said, "At your time of life, it's not very becoming to anoint yourself with perfumed oil," which was a very Greek way of saying, don't get above your station, old woman. So I don't think he'd be particularly welcome at this lunch today. She really had hit the nail on the head, Panico. Pericles was all puffed up with pride, when really he should have been hanging his head in shame. The elder women of the ancient world were often very heroic. In the same century, we encounter a lady called Telesilla, who came from Argos in Greece. And in 494 BC, the Spartans decided to invade her city, and Telesilla led the defense effort. So while the men went out to confront the oncoming enemy, Telesilla directed the slaves, she directed the women and the old people to form almost a human wall of defense around the perimeter of the city. And then she herself went around gathering whatever weaponry she could find that was left in the city. She went to people's houses, she went to the temples, and she armed the women. And the Spartans supposedly were so taken aback by encountering all these women, lots of elderly women among them, they decided to turn around, considering it rather shameful to have to fight them face to face. So a statue of this heroic woman, Telesilla, was then put up, and the war god Ares, who was usually worshipped by men, was then worshipped as a female god as well in her city of Argos. I would add to my roster of wonderful elder women from the ancient world an honourable mention for Terentia. She was married to Cicero, and she lived to the age of 103, which was quite amazing for the Roman period. It wasn't easy being married to Cicero. He was a man who thrived on being praised. He needed to be praised a lot, Cicero. He famously gasconaded in his triumph of having saved the Roman Republic from this devastating conspiracy to overthrow it, led by Catiline and his forces. But actually, hidden in the historic sources, we find that Cicero received his intelligence about this plot from a woman who no one really ever speaks of today. Her name was Fulvia. She got very little of the credit for Cicero's part in this, and Terentia got even less. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not hate Cicero at all. I think he was a brilliant orator, and I'll always have a soft spot for him. But boy, I would not want to be married to him. In some ways, he found his perfect match in Terentia. She loved talking about politics, if ever they were having a conversation and it turned to the topic of domesticity, of cleaning, of washing, she would immediately change the subject and talk about something far more interesting, usually something political. So I think she was very much my kind of woman. When Cicero was then exiled by Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, Terentia kept her ear to the ground to work out who the next year's politicians would be so that she could chart what hope he would have of being recalled to Rome. Besides all this, she managed her own property. She had her own sort of tenement blocks that she looked after. So she was pretty capable. So I feel incredibly sorry for her when Cicero then did return home from exile and promptly divorced her and remarried. And he was about 60 at this time, and his new bride was 14 or 15. Terentia said to people, "Oh, he's been charmed by her beauty," which may have been true, but far more than that, he was charmed by her money. He and his wife had to move out of their luxurious villa on the Palatine Hill in Rome when he was exiled, and they'd had to sell off a lot of their belongings and furniture, so they weren't living the kind of life that they had beforehand. And Publilia, the new young bride, just happened to be Cicero's ward, so he knew precisely what her bank balance was. He had protection of it already. In the event, their marriage broke down just months later, but by then the damage had already been done. Not a lot of writing by women survives from the ancient world, but I'm reminded at this point of a short truism by a Greek woman called Praxilla. And I think this is kind of as relevant to domestic life as it is to political life, to be honest. She said, "Under every stone, my friend, watch out for a scorpion." I think never has that been said so well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy, and thank you so much to all three of our terrific speakers. who will all be outside just this door behind me, not where they signed books before lunch, literally just behind this door. And thank you all so much for coming to the Oldie lunch. Thank you so much.
I just wanted one more word, and that is to ask you to lift a glass to two wonderful women and two fascinating books, to Gill and Daisy.
And to dear Geoffrey Wheatcroft. Yeah.
You have been listening to the Oldie podcast. Please share this episode. Look out for the Oldie magazine subscription offer on our website www.theoldie.co.uk. Thank you and good luck.